The Grand Meridian Hotel shimmered like a jewel in the heart of Shanghai, its glass facade reflecting the endless city lights that pulsed with life far below. Inside, on the 78th floor, a grand banquet hall had been transformed into a fortress of wealth and ambition. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, and every table gleamed with silver and glass. The air hummed with polite conversation, the sound of measured laughter, and the occasional chime of champagne glasses colliding in quiet triumph. At the head table sat Alexander Grant, the billionaire founder and CEO of Grant Global Technologies, a man whose confidence was said to be unshakable. He had built empires, crushed competitors, and turned innovation into power. Tonight, however, there was no trace of his usual calm dominance. Beneath the sharp black suit, his composure was unraveling thread by thread. Across from him sat Mr. Liang Zhao, the chairman of Zhao Industrial Systems, one of the largest robotics manufacturers in China. The deal on the table of $500 million joint venture was meant to be the crown jewel of Grant's Asian expansion. It would open new markets, merge cutting-edge AI research with mass manufacturing, and secure his legacy for decades. But there was one problem. A simple, catastrophic problem. The translator hadn't shown up. "Where is Chen?" Alexander hissed under his breath to his assistant, a trembling young man named Patrick. "He was supposed to be here an hour ago." I don't know, sir," Patrick stammered. His flight was delayed out of Beijing. And then his phone. Alexander slammed a hand on the table, rattling the crystal. The noise silenced the nearest conversations. Mr. Liang raised an eyebrow, but remained politely still, his calm face betraying nothing. He spoke a few words in Mandarin to his advisors, and they nodded, whispering among themselves. Alexander could feel the temperature drop. He didn't understand the language, but he didn't need to. He knew that kind of whisper. It was the sound of doubt, of slipping leverage. Without a translator, the negotiation couldn't proceed. Weeks of preparation, millions spent on travel, media coverage waiting outside. All of it was teetering on the edge of collapse. Across the hall, waiters moved like a silent army, refilling glasses and clearing plates with precision. One of them, a young woman named Lena Zhou, noticed the growing tension at the head table. She'd been working double shifts at the Grand Meridian for months, saving every yuan to support her mother back home in Hangzhou. Normally, she kept her head down, but tonight was different. She could feel the shift in the room, the fear, the confusion, the power vacuum that suddenly opened like a wound. She glanced again at the foreign businessman whose expression was tightening with frustration. She recognized him instantly. Alexander Grant, the American billionaire whose company's logo she'd seen on billboards and phone screens across the city. He looked like a man used to control, but right now, he looked lost. She hesitated. It wasn't her place. It wasn't her business. But as she saw him attempting to mime through a sentence to Mr. Liang, pointing to documents, gesturing helplessly, something inside her snapped. She'd studied business English and Mandarin interpretation at university before she had to drop out. She dreamed of working in boardrooms like this, not serving them. And now, fate had dropped one right in front of her. When Alexander finally stood up, muttering something about postponing the meeting. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly in English, her tray trembling slightly in her hands. "I couldn't help overhearing. Are you missing your translator?" Alexander turned, half annoyed, half startled. "Yes," he said sharply. "Do you know one?" Lena hesitated only a second before saying, "I can translate. If you'll allow me." The table went silent. Mr. Liang looked up, intrigued. The billionaire's assistants exchanged stunned glances. Alexander studied her, this waitress in a neat black uniform, her hair tied back, her expression composed but determined. "Chew?" he asked skeptically. "You speak Mandarin and English?" "And business Mandarin," she added quietly. "Fluently." Mr. Liang smiled faintly, saying something in Mandarin that made his advisors chuckle. Lena turned to him and responded smoothly, her tone respectful but confident. The laughter stopped instantly. Mr. Liang's expression shifted from amusement to genuine surprise. Alexander blinked. "What did he say?" "He said this is an unusual setting for a negotiation," Lena translated calmly. "And I told him that great deals sometimes begin in unexpected places." For the first time that evening, Alexander smiled. "All right," he said, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "Miss Joe," she replied. "Lena Joe, Miss Joe," he said, lowering himself back into his seat. "Let's see what you can do." As she sat down, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. What began as a dinner was about to turn into the most unlikely negotiation in Grant Global's history, and Lena Joe, the hotel waitress, was about to rewrite it all. The silence that followed Lena's words was electric. Even the clinking of cutlery and murmured conversations around the banquet hall seemed to fade into the background. Everyone was watching the impossible and uninvited waitress stepping into the highest stakes business meeting in the city. Lena adjusted her seat, her heart pounding in her chest so loudly she was sure they could all hear it. But on the outside, she remained calm. Her face was composed, her posture perfect. Years of observing guests had taught her how to hide emotion behind a polite smile. Tonight, that lesson would serve her better than ever. Alexander slid a contract draft across the table and leaned toward her. "Tell him," he said quietly, his voice taut with urgency, "that we're offering full technology sharing, AI design blueprints, robotics integration systems, everything. This partnership will benefit both sides." Lena nodded and turned toward Mr. Liang. She repeated the statement in fluent, formal Mandarin, but she didn't simply translate word for word. She adapted it, adjusted tone, phrasing, and cultural nuance. She added honorifics, shifted idioms, and infused the statement with subtle humility. When she finished, Mr. Liang's expression softened. He nodded thoughtfully before responding in Mandarin a long, carefully phrased answer. Lena listened intently, then turned back to Alexander. "He appreciates the offer, but he's concerned," she explained. "He says that technology sharing often means loss of control. He believes your company might use the partnership to dominate their domestic market." Alexander frowned. "That's not true. Tell him we're equals in this deal." She translated again, but not directly. "Chairman Liang," she said in Mandarin, Mr. Grant believes this partnership should be one of mutual strength, not competition. He says that the bridge between innovation and craftsmanship is strongest when built by two equals. Mr. Liang smiled faintly, clearly pleased by her phrasing. He replied with a short remark that made his advisors nod in agreement. Lena turned back to Alexander. He says that's a poetic way to see business. Alexander exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little. Tell him that poetry is something I'm learning to appreciate tonight. As she relayed his message, a ripple of laughter moved through the Chinese delegation. Warm, genuine laughter. The atmosphere changed. The ice that had threatened to freeze the room began to melt. Over the next hour, Lena guided both sides through the thorniest parts of the negotiation. She didn't just translate words, she translated intentions. When Alexander's tone became too aggressive, she softened it. When Mr. Liang's pride risked derailing progress, she reframed the point in a way that preserved dignity. She turned what could have been a disaster into a delicate dance of diplomacy. When the final toasts were made, the impossible had happened. Both sides had agreed to continue negotiations the next morning. The potential $500 million deal was back on the table. As the guests began to leave, Alexander stood and extended a hand to her. "Miss Zhou," he said quietly, "you may have just saved me a fortune." Lena smiled faintly, though she could hardly believe any of it was real. "I only did what I could, sir." "What you did," he said, "was prevent a catastrophe." He turned to his assistant. "Patrick, get Miss Zhou's contact information. I want her at tomorrow's meeting." Patrick blinked. "Sir, she's—" Alexander cut him off. "I know exactly what she is. She's the only person in this room who kept this deal alive." Lena bowed slightly, thanked him, and retreated from the table, her hands trembling once she was safely out of sight. In the service hallway, she leaned against the wall, heart racing, mind spinning. What had she just done? But fate had already taken notice. The next morning, the city woke to a pale winter sun spilling over the skyline. Inside the Grant Global penthouse suite, Alexander sat at a sleek black dining table, staring at a stack of documents. He hadn't slept much. His mind kept replaying the events of the night before. The poised waitress, who had spoken with the confidence of a diplomat. The way the meeting had shifted the moment she began to speak. He'd seen talented negotiators before. He'd hired the best consultants money could buy. But what Lena had done went beyond skill. She had instinct. Patrick entered the room nervously. "Sir, the Zhao team confirmed tomorrow's session at 10 a.m., he said. "Should I book a new interpreter?" Alexander looked up slowly. "No. Find the waitress. Miss Zhou, she's our interpreter now." Patrick froze. "Sir, with respect, she's not a professional. She's exactly what we need," Alexander interrupted. "Find her." Down in the hotel's service wing, Lena was already back at work, tying her apron for the breakfast shift. She had convinced herself that last night had been a beautiful accident, an impossible moment that would vanish like a dream come morning. She hadn't expected anyone to call. So when two men in dark suits appeared in the staff corridor asking for her by name, the entire kitchen stopped to stare. "Miss Zhou," one of them asked politely. Mr. Grant would like to see you immediately. The head chef nearly dropped his ladle. The other waiters whispered in disbelief. Lena blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Now? She asked. Now? The man confirmed. Moments later, she found herself in the glass elevator, rising higher and higher above the city. Her reflections staring back at her, a hotel waitress in uniform, heading toward the penthouse of one of the world's most powerful men. As the elevator doors slid open, Alexander Grant stood waiting. His posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable. "Miss Joe," he said, his tone softer than before. "I have a car waiting downstairs. It'll take you to my office. We have a lot to discuss." Lena hesitated, unsure if she was dreaming again. "To your office?" He nodded. "You saved my company last night. I don't plan to forget that." The morning light caught the skyline behind him, reflecting in the glass like fire. Somewhere deep inside her, Lena felt something shift, a door opening to a future she'd never dared imagine. And just like that, the waitress stepped into a world she had only ever served from the outside. The elevator doors opened to the 90th floor of the Grant Global Shanghai headquarters, revealing a space that looked more like a private art gallery than an office. The walls were lined with digital screens displaying global stock trends, and the floor gleamed like polished obsidian. Everything about the place radiated precision, power, and the unspoken rule that only the elite belonged here. As Lena stepped out, still dressed in her plain hotel uniform, she instantly felt out of place. The receptionists paused mid-sentence, their smiles faltering. Executives in tailored suits passed by without a glance, their conversations fluid with business jargon she only half understood. For a brief moment, she considered turning back. Then Alexander Grant's voice echoed down the hall. "Miss Joe," he said, striding toward her. He was already in motion, phone in one hand, a file in the other, moving with that signature mix of urgency and control. But when he reached her, he stopped, his tone softening. "Glad you came." She bowed slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Grant. I hope I didn't interrupt anything." "Interrupt?" He smiled faintly. "You're the only reason this meeting is even happening." He led her through glass doors into the executive boardroom, a sprawling space overlooking the Wangpu River. A dozen men and women sat around a long table, each with a laptop open, their expressions sharp and skeptical. These were the people who guarded Alexander's empire: lawyers, strategists, and corporate sharks who could smell weakness from a mile away. At the head of the table, Richard Hale, Grant Global's CFO, leaned back in his chair with folded arms. His gaze landed on Lena, and the faintest smirk crossed his lips. "Mr. Grant," he said smoothly, "I wasn't aware we'd started hiring hotel staff as consultants." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room. Alexander didn't flinch. "You weren't aware because it wasn't your decision," he replied coolly. Then, turning to Lena, "Miss Joe, meet my executive team." Lena smiled politely and nodded, though she could feel the weight of every stare on her. "Yesterday," Alexander continued, "we nearly lost a $500 million deal because our translator didn't show up. Miss Joe here stepped in and saved it. She'll be joining us for today's negotiation with Zhao Industrial." Richard raised an eyebrow. With all due respect, sir, a waitress is not qualified for corporate interpretation. We have certified translators available. Alexander cut him off. Certified translators don't always save deals, Richard. She did. The room fell silent. Alexander's word was law, but the tension remained. Lena could feel it pressing against her chest like a physical weight. She wanted to disappear, but instead she straightened her posture and met their eyes. "I may not have a certification," she said softly, "but I do understand communication and respect. Last night, that was what made the difference. That line caught them off guard." Even Richard blinked. Alexander smiled slightly. "Let's get started." The meeting began. On the large conference screen, Chairman Liang and his team appeared via live video from their Shanghai headquarters. The tone was formal, cautious. Every word mattered. Lena sat beside Alexander, translating in real time. Her voice was calm, measured, confident. She didn't just relay sentences. She adjusted them, bridging to worlds separated not only by language, but by culture. When Alexander outlined his company's offer, joint AI development, shared patents, manufacturing rights, Mr. Liang frowned slightly and spoke for several minutes. The executives on Grant's side exchanged anxious glances. Lena listened, then said quietly to Alexander, "He believes the proposed profit split is unfair. He thinks it suggests a lack of respect." Alexander exhaled. "It's a fair split. 55 to 45. Asterisk not in his eyes." Lena replied gently. "In Chinese business culture, respect often matters more than numbers. If he feels diminished, no deal will hold." Alexander looked at her, considering her words. Then he nodded slowly. "All right. Adjust it. 50-50. She turned back to the camera and conveyed the revised offer in perfect Mandarin. Her tone firm but diplomatic. Mr. Liang's brows lifted in mild surprise. He leaned to his advisor, whispered something, then smiled. Moments later, the mood shifted. The conversation warmed. The impossible negotiation began to move again. For the next 2 hours, Lena guided the discussion with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. When tempers flared, she calmed them. When pride interfered, she redirected. When logic failed, she appealed to vision. By the end of the session, both parties had agreed to preliminary partnership terms, a miracle, considering the disaster that had loomed just 24 hours before. When the call ended, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Richard Hale leaned back and let out a slow breath. "Well," he muttered, "that was unexpected." Alexander stood. "No," he said quietly, "that was exceptional." He turned to Lena. "You just negotiated what half my legal department couldn't." Lena blinked, speechless. You only saved the deal." "Again," he said. Richard cleared his throat. "Sir, this is still highly irregular." "Irregular," Alexander said, "is how progress starts." He closed the folder and gave Lena a small nod. "Miss Zhou, I'll need you to stay on as part of my delegation. You'll be compensated accordingly." She stared at him, stunned. "You mean, as your translator?" He smiled faintly. "For now." That night, when she returned to her small apartment above the noodle shop she rented. Lena sat by the window overlooking the neon-lit city. The streets below pulsed with color and noise. But her mind was somewhere else back in the boardroom. In that impossible moment when she'd earned the respect of billionaires, she'd spent her life serving others. Now, for the first time, she'd been seen. What she didn't know was that far across the city, in his penthouse office, Alexander Grant stood alone by the glass, whiskey in hand, replaying the day's events in his head. He'd built his empire on logic, money, and control. But something about that young woman, the clarity in her eyes, the calm in her voice, the way she understood people better than his entire team had shaken something inside him. He couldn't quite name. He didn't know it yet. But Lena Jo wasn't just going to save his deal. She was going to change his entire world. The next morning, the sky over Shanghai was washed in a soft silver haze. For the city, it was just another weekday. But for Lena Jo, it was the morning her life officially changed. She stood outside Grant Global's headquarters once again, this time in a crisp white blouse and fitted navy skirt, her hair neatly tied back. It wasn't luxury, just careful simplicity. But to her, it felt like armor. She paused for a breath before stepping through the tall glass doors, clutching a small notebook she'd bought from a street vendor that morning. On the first page, she had written a single line in English: "Every empire starts with courage." Inside the building, employees bustled between meetings, their badges gleaming, their conversations sharp with jargon. No one looked twice at her, which was fine. She wasn't here to be noticed. She was here to earn her place. At the reception desk, a young woman looked up. "Good morning. May I help you?" "Yes," Lena said politely. "I'm here for Mr. Grant's team. He asked me to start today." The receptionist blinked, then checked the system. "Name?" "Lena Jo." The moment the name registered, the receptionist straightened, surprise flickering across her face. "Of course, Miss Jo. Mr. Grant mentioned you." That phrase, "Mr. Grant mentioned you," sent a small, surreal warmth through her chest. Moments later, she was led up to the executive floor. The glass hallway seemed even longer than before, its silence heavy with status. Through the transparent walls, she could see departments filled with analysts, lawyers, translators, all professionals who had probably spent years climbing to be where they were. And she, a hotel waitress, was walking straight past them. Inside the boardroom, Richard Hale and a few department heads were already gathered around the table, reviewing documents. They looked up in unison when Lena entered. Richard's expression barely hid his irritation. "Miss Jo," he said in that silky voice of his, "you're early." "I was taught that being early is being prepared," she replied simply. He gave a thin smile. "We'll see if that holds true in business," before the tension could deepen. The door opened, and Alexander Grant entered. The room straightened instantly, as if gravity itself had changed. "Morning," he said briskly, setting down his phone. "Let's get started. We have 48 hours to finalize presentation materials for Beijing." He turned to Lena. "Miss Jo, you'll sit beside me during prep and negotiations. I want your input on phrasing, tone, and interpretation." Your instincts were right yesterday. I trust them." The executives glanced at one another, barely masking their discomfort. Richard cleared his throat. "Sir, with respect, Miss Joe isn't trained in corporate communications. She might do what no one else here could." Alexander interrupted. "Keep the deal alive." That silenced the room. He motioned for Lena to sit. "Let's begin." For the next few hours, Lena absorbed everything: the language of contracts, the art of persuasion, the rhythm of corporate strategy. She took notes on tone, posture, and subtext, how Alexander's team presented power versus how Mr. Liang's team might interpret it. Her mind worked like a bridge between cultures. When the analysts proposed data-heavy slides, she suggested subtle narrative adjustments that would resonate more deeply with Chinese partners. When Richard argued that numbers spoke louder than stories, she countered gently: "Numbers convince the mind. Respect convinces the heart. In China, you need both." Richard looked ready to argue, but Alexander simply said, "She's right." By noon, Lena had become an unexpected part of the team. Later that evening, when the office finally emptied, Alexander stayed behind. He stood by the window, sleeves rolled up, eyes on the city's shimmering lights. "You're quieter than usual," he said without turning. Lena glanced up from her notes. "I'm just taking it all in." He smiled faintly. "Most people panic their first day here." "I think I already did my panicking," she said softly. He turned to look at her then, really look. There was no trace of the commanding billionaire, only curiosity. "You handled Richard well today." "I wasn't trying to handle him," she replied. "I just spoke honestly. Honesty's dangerous in my world." "Maybe that's why it works," she said. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "You have a rare kind of confidence, Miss Joe. It's not loud, but it doesn't bend." Lena lowered her eyes. "Confidence comes easier when you've had to earn every inch of respect you get." That line lingered between them, unspoken but understood. The next morning, rumors were already spreading through Grant Global. The billionaire's Waitress turned interpreter, who had outshone the board. Some called it luck. Others whispered jealousy. In the break room, two assistants murmured as Lena passed, "Did you hear? She's flying with Mr. Grant to Beijing." Seriously? She's replacing the entire language team? She must have done something to impress him. Lena ignored the whispers, but they stung. It was the same old story. People assuming her worth was borrowed from someone else's attention. But when she entered Alexander's office later that day, he didn't see a rumor. He saw results. Mr. Liang confirmed the final meeting. He said, sliding her a printed itinerary. "Beijing, tomorrow at 9 a.m. you'll be at my side for the presentation." This could seal the deal once and for all. She accepted the document carefully. "I won't let you down. You haven't yet," he said with quiet conviction. As she turned to leave, he added, "And Lena." She paused. He smiled slightly. "No one at this company is doing you a favor. You earned your seat here. Don't forget that." Her chest tightened. For a moment, the noise of the city outside faded, replaced by a calm she hadn't felt in years. "Thank you, Mr. Grant," she said softly. "I won't." That night, as her train sped north toward Beijing, The city lights faded behind her like stars falling into shadow. She stared out the window, thinking of the road that had led her here. From carrying trays to carrying the trust of a billionaire. Ahead lay the real test, the boardroom where millions would be decided, and where the waitress from the Grand Meridian would have to prove, once again, that she belonged. The jet touched down at Beijing Capital International Airport under a pale winter sky. The runway shimmered faintly in the morning frost as the engines slowed to silence. Inside the sleek Grant Global private jet, Alexander Grant sat by the window, his jaw tight, his mind running through every risk, every variable. Across from him, Lena Zhou reviewed the final draft of the presentation slides, every word, every cultural cue, every piece of tone carefully adjusted for precision. She had spent the entire flight rehearsing in her mind, not the numbers, but the rhythm of how the meeting would feel, the pauses that earned respect, the idioms that built trust, the way a bow at the right time could soften an entire room. Alexander closed his laptop and studied her for a moment. "You don't seem nervous," he said. Lena looked up, a small smile on her lips. "I learned that nerves don't help the truth come out. And that's all I have, the truth." He nodded slightly. "You've got more than that." She wasn't sure what he meant, but the tone in his voice stayed with her all the way to the car. The drive into the city was quiet. Beijing's winter skyline flashing by outside steel towers lost in morning mist, red lanterns swaying from shop fronts, and the endless hum of life when they arrived at the Zhao Industrial Headquarters. The scale was overwhelming. The building's facade was all glass and marble, its logo a soaring metallic phoenix reflecting the sun. A long red carpet stretched from the entrance, flanked by assistants and media crews. The merger talks had become public interest. The Chinese press called it the East-West Alliance as they stepped out. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts. Alexander adjusted his cufflinks, his face composed as always. Lena walked half a step behind him, calm and steady until she caught sight of someone she hadn't expected, standing near the entrance. With a polished smile and a sharp blue suit was Victor Lang, Grant Global's regional director for East Asia. Mr. Grant, Victor said smoothly as they approached. "Welcome back to Beijing. I wasn't aware you'd be bringing additional staff." His eyes flicked toward Lena with the faintest glint of disdain. Alexander's reply was short. "Miss Zhou is part of my team, of course," Victor said with a thin smile. "Though I should mention we've already arranged for a professional translator for the meeting, certified by both governments. It might simplify things." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a challenge. Alexander met his gaze. "No need. Miss Zhou will handle translation personally." Victor hesitated, his smile stiffening. "As you wish, sir." Lena could feel the tension between them. Something unspoken, political, territorial. But Alexander didn't break stride. He was trusting her completely. And that trust would have to be enough. Inside the massive boardroom, the atmosphere was formal, heavy with ceremony. Chairman Liang Zhao sat at the center of a long table carved from black stone, his team arrayed beside him. The Grant Global delegation took their seats opposite, a polished mirror of Western suits facing Eastern poise. Victor took a seat 2 chairs down from Alexander, clearly positioning himself as an observer, but his cold glance toward Lena said otherwise. The meeting began. Lena translated with flawless precision, her voice clear and balanced, every phrase crafted to maintain harmony. But as the discussion deepened, she could sense something off. Mr. Liang's advisors began interrupting, questioning details Alexander hadn't yet presented. Someone had leaked the proposal ahead of time. Alexander frowned, leaning toward Victor. Who shared these files? Victor's expression was one of practiced innocence. I'm not sure, sir. Could have been miscommunication. Lena watched quietly, reading between the lines. She'd seen enough power games at the hotel to recognize sabotage when it unfolded in front of her. Mr. Liang spoke again, his tone polite but edged with skepticism. Lena translated carefully. He says he's concerned Grant Global may not honor local manufacturing rights. He wants reassurance, something written, not spoken. Alexander's response was crisp. We've provided full documentation. The terms are clear, but the energy in the room was shifting. Doubt was spreading. The deal was slipping again. Lena could almost feel the weight of it, the disbelief, the cultural dissonance, the mistrust of foreign promises. And then something in her broke through the hesitation. She leaned slightly toward Alexander. May I speak? She whispered. He gave a slight nod. Lena stood. The entire room turned toward her, the waitress, standing among billionaires. In Mandarin, her voice steady but warm. She addressed the Zhao delegation directly. Chairman Liang, she began. When two rivers meet, they don't blend immediately. The waters swirl, test each other, find balance. This deal is not about control, it's about trust. And trust cannot be printed on paper. It's earned in how we listen, and how we keep our word when no one is watching. The room fell silent. Every word hung in the air like fine silk. Liang studied her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. You speak well, Miss Zhou. You remind me of my daughter. She also believes business should serve people, not just numbers. He turned back to Alexander. We'll continue the discussion after lunch. There's potential here. When the delegation left the room, Alexander turned to her slowly, expression unreadable. What you just did, he said, wasn't in the script. Lena hesitated. I'm sorry if I don't apologize. He smiled faintly. You saved us again. Victor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. That night, the delegation checked into the Four Seasons Beijing, the city glowing gold beyond the tall windows. As Lena sat alone in her suite, she stared at her reflection in the mirror, the same face she'd seen every day for years, now carrying the weight of million-dollar negotiations. The waitress was still there, but so was someone new. And in the room next door, Alexander Grant was staring out at the same skyline, glass of scotch in hand, wondering how a young woman who'd appeared out of nowhere could see through every wall he'd ever built for the first time in a decade. The billionaire couldn't sleep. Morning light filtered through the high glass walls of Zhao Industrial Headquarters, washing the marble floors in a soft silver glow. The second day of negotiations was meant to finalize the terms: technical integration, revenue shares, intellectual property rights. On paper, it was simple. In reality, It was a minefield. The air in the boardroom was heavier than before. The media had caught wind of tensions from the previous session. Rumors whispered that the deal might fall apart. Grant Global's stock price had already dipped by 2% overnight. One misstep today, and everything Alexander Grant had built in Asia could collapse. He walked in looking every bit the composed billionaire again, tailored navy suit, polished shoes, and an expression carved in steel. But Lena Jo, walking behind him with her binder pressed close to her chest, noticed the faint stiffness in his shoulders. Across the table, Victor Lang was already seated, smiling faintly, a tablet in front of him. He looked too calm, too ready. Chairman Liang entered moments later, greeted by handshakes and formal bows. As the opening pleasantries were exchanged, Victor leaned slightly toward Alexander and murmured, "Just a reminder, sir, I've revised the contract presentation this morning. Small technical updates." Alexander frowned. "I didn't authorize changes. It's just formatting," Victor replied smoothly, "to align with their documentation style." But Lena saw the flicker in his eyes. She'd seen that same look on hotel guests who pretended to tip, then signed the bill and left nothing. The meeting began. The first slides appeared on the massive wall screen, projected in English and Mandarin side by side. Victor handled the clicker, his voice controlled and professional as he narrated the structure of the partnership agreement. Lena translated, maintaining her rhythm. Then, midway through the third section, she froze. The Mandarin text on the screen didn't match what Victor was saying. Subtle differences, tiny phrasing changes that, to a casual reader, meant nothing. But to a linguist like her, they screamed trap. One phrase in particular chilled her: full manufacturing oversight by Grant Global. In English, that sounded like collaborative supervision. But in Mandarin, Victor had written exclusive control over manufacturing process and approvals. It was a single word instead of, but it changed the meaning entirely. It made the deal look predatory, imperial. If Mr. Liang signed under that phrasing, his board would see him as a traitor to domestic industry. The entire partnership would collapse, and Grant Global would be branded as deceitful. Lena's pulse raced. She looked at Alexander, but he was focused on the charts. She couldn't wait. She had seconds. "Excuse me," she said suddenly, interrupting Victor's flow. Her voice was calm, but edged with quiet authority. "There seems to be an inconsistency in the translation on this slide." Victor turned sharply, his voice low. "Miss Jo, this is not your place." But Alexander cut in, his tone cold. "Let her speak." Lena walked up to the screen, pointed at the Mandarin characters, and spoke directly to Chairman Liang in flawless, formal Chinese. "Esteemed Chairman Liang, this phrase does not mean collaborative supervision. It translates to exclusive control, which removes your company's manufacturing autonomy." A murmur rippled through the room. Liang's aides leaned forward, scanning their tablets. Their eyes widened. Lena continued, switching effortlessly to English. "It's a mistranslation that reverses the intent of the deal. The English text is correct, but the Mandarin version would invalidate the trust we're trying to build." Alexander's eyes snapped to Victor. "You did this?" Victor lifted his hands, pretending innocence. "A clerical error, Perhaps. These documents go through several systems, don't? Alexander said quietly, dangerously. Don't insult my intelligence. The room was silent except for the low hum of the projector. Mr. Liang finally leaned back, studying both men. Then his gaze shifted to Lena. You saw it instantly. You could have ignored it. Lena met his eyes. Respect must be mutual, Chairman. Without it, the best numbers mean nothing. There was a pause and then the old man smiled. Slow and genuine. You have my respect, Miss Joe. He turned to Alexander. We will proceed with discussions tomorrow. I believe in transparency. I see that you do, too. And with that, the meeting ended. The moment the door closed behind the Zhao delegation, Alexander turned sharply to Victor. Pack your things. You're done. Victor's composure cracked for the first time. You can't, I can. And I just did, Alexander said. Security will escort you from the building. Effective immediately. He turned away before Victor could reply, his voice low but trembling with anger. You tried to sabotage me in my own boardroom. Lena stood still, her heart pounding, watching the fallout unfold like a slow earthquake. When the door slammed behind Victor, Alexander exhaled for the first time in minutes. He turned toward her, his voice quieter now. You didn't just save this deal, Lena. You saved the company. Her hands were still trembling, but her eyes were steady. It's what anyone would have done. No, he said, shaking his head. Not anyone. Only you saw it. He hesitated, then added softly. You were right that night in Shanghai. Great deals start in unexpected places, and sometimes so do great people outside the windows. The city glowed with twilight, the skyline blazing like 1,000 tiny fires. Lena looked out, her reflection merging with the lights. For the first time, she felt it. She wasn't standing at the edge of power anymore. She was stepping into it. News spreads fast in the corporate world, faster than fire, faster than truth. By the next morning, whispers about the Shanghai Translator incident had already reached the American financial press. A deal saved by a waitress, one headline read. Mistranslation nearly destroys Grant global negotiations, said another. In the top floor suite of the Grand Meridian Hotel, Alexander Grant sat by the window, staring at the glowing cityscape below. The night before had felt like both victory and disaster. Victor Lang's betrayal had been a brutal reminder that not every threat came from across the table. Sometimes it sat right beside you. But the deal wasn't over. Chairman Liang had agreed to one final round of talks before signing. One chance left, and this time Alexander wasn't taking any chances. Across the suite, Lena Joe sat at the polished oak desk, laptop open, surrounded by translated contracts, legal memos, and press summaries. Her uniform was gone. In its place, she wore a crisp white blouse and a simple navy blazer loaned from one of the PR assistants. Yet even now, she couldn't quite believe it was real. 40-8 hours ago, she'd been serving champagne. Now, she was preparing notes for one of the biggest cross-border deals in Asia. Alexander turned toward her, his tone serious but warm. You know, the board wants to fly in a professional translator for the final session tomorrow. Lena paused. Of course. That makes sense. He smirked slightly. I told them no. Her fingers froze over the keyboard. What? You're the only person who's earned both sides' trust. Liang respects you. My entire team saw what you did. And he hesitated, almost smiling. I think the media might, too. She looked at him, unsure if she'd heard right. Media? He held up his phone. On the screen was an article trending on multiple platforms. Hotel waitress saves multi-million-dollar deal with flawless translation. Lena blinked. That's ridiculous. They make it sound like a movie. Alexander laughed quietly. It is a movie. You just happen to be living it. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Tomorrow's session will be public. Cameras, reporters, live feeds. If we pull this off, it's not just a contract, it's a global statement. Cross-cultural partnership, trust, human brilliance over AI, and money. She exhaled slowly. That's a lot of pressure. He smiled. Pressure makes diamonds, Miss Joe. That afternoon, Lena walked the marble hallways of the hotel in silence. Every passing employee gave her double takes. The girl they'd seen carrying trays was now being escorted to private briefings with billionaires. Some whispered, some smiled, and a few simply stared, unsure how to process what they were seeing. She stopped at the staff cafe where she used to eat her 5-minute meals between shifts. The same cashier, May, stood behind the counter. Lena? May gasped. You, what happened? You're in the news. Lena laughed softly. Yeah, I saw. They say you saved a billionaire. I just did my job, Lena said, shrugging. But her eyes softened, and maybe a little more, when she left. The staff watched her go with quiet pride. For once, one of their own wasn't invisible. That night, as the city lights shimmered on the river, Alexander hosted a closed strategy session. His executives gathered around the table, tired, cautious, but ready. Lena stood at the head beside him, notebook in hand. Patrick, the assistant, leaned over and whispered, I can't believe this. You're leading tomorrow's talks. She smiled faintly. Neither can I. Alexander began the meeting. Tomorrow, we finalize. Liang's board wants clarity on profit distribution and technical control. No surprises, no hidden clauses. We lead with transparency, empathy, and truth. Lena walked us through the translation briefs. She nodded, stepping forward with poise that would have been unimaginable days ago. Her Mandarin explanation flowed effortlessly, precise, elegant, diplomatic. She adjusted idioms for cultural nuance, restructured phrasing for mutual benefit, and bridged technical jargon with human intent. When she finished, the room was silent. Alexander broke it first. Gentlemen, he said, looking around the table, that's what real communication sounds like. For the first time in a long time, his team applauded. Not because of authority, but because of respect. Later, as the room emptied, Alexander lingered by the window. You ever think, he said quietly, that you were meant to be somewhere else all along, but life just took the scenic route? Lena smiled faintly. Maybe the scenic route teaches you how to see things no one else notices. He turned toward her, studying her face, the calm intelligence, the quiet fire in her eyes. Tomorrow's not just about signing papers. It's about rewriting how the world sees people like you She tilted her head. People like me? People who were never supposed to be in the room but make the room better once they are outside. Shanghai glittered like a city made of dreams. And tomorrow, in that glittering maze of power and ambition, a former waitress would walk into a conference room and change global business forever. The next morning, Shanghai awoke to a different kind of electricity. The streets around the Zhao Industrial Tower were lined with black sedans and news vans. Reporters clutched microphones, photographers adjusted lenses, and camera drones hovered in the hazy air. Inside the glass lobby, security teams scanned badges as executives, translators, and journalists filed toward the 60th floor. Today's negotiation was no longer just a meeting. It was an event, the kind that would define reputations and ripple across continents. At exactly 9 a.m., the elevator doors slid open. Alexander Grant stepped out first, confident, focused, his every move measured. But when the cameras turned, they didn't just capture him. They captured the young woman walking beside him in the navy blazer and white blouse, her dark hair tied neatly, her expression calm and composed. "Who's that?" A journalist whispered. "That's her." Another replied. "The waitress who saved the deal." Lena Jo tried to ignore the flash of cameras as she followed Alexander into the boardroom. The walls gleamed with mahogany, the city stretched endlessly behind them, and the long table gleamed with neat folders, microphones, and glass bottles of water lined in perfect symmetry. On the opposite side sat Chairman Liang, surrounded by his team, calm, poised, unreadable. When he saw Lena, his expression softened ever so slightly. "Miss Jo," he greeted in Mandarin. "Good to see you again." Lena bowed politely. "The honor is mine, Chairman Liang." Alexander leaned toward her and whispered, "You've got this." The meeting began. Formal greetings, acknowledgements, and brief summaries were exchanged. Then came the core issues, the clauses that had stalled progress for weeks: profit distribution, intellectual property control, and production oversight. Each word mattered. Each pause felt like a heartbeat too loud. Victor's sabotage had poisoned the air with mistrust, and everyone knew it. Liang's advisors leaned on every syllable, wary of hidden meaning. Alexander's legal team kept glancing toward Lena, relying entirely on her voice to hold the deal together. And she did. Her translations weren't robotic or mechanical. They breathed. She didn't just convert words. She carried intent. When Alexander spoke about partnership, she added warmth. When Liang raised concerns about ownership, she layered respect. Every phrase balanced ambition with humility. At one point, Liang's lead advisor leaned forward. "In our language, sharing technology implies possible transfer of proprietary systems. That's dangerous for us." Lena nodded, thinking fast. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "we can rephrase it as mutual development of technology under joint stewardship. It means shared progress without loss of sovereignty." Both sides paused. Liang's advisor murmured approval. Alexander nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what I meant." Lena smiled faintly. "Then let's say it that way." Hours passed. The air grew heavy with fatigue and tension. Reporters outside whispered updates through earpieces, waiting for a breakthrough. Then, Just before noon came the final point. Manufacturing rights. It was the same clause that Victor had nearly weaponized. The room tensed instantly. Liang's voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Chairman Grant, how can we trust that this time the translation reflects your true intention? Alexander opened his mouth, but Lena raised a hand gently. Allow me. She turned to the projection screen, her hands steady despite the pounding in her chest. She spoke in Mandarin first, slow, deliberate, clear. The spirit of this agreement is not control, but collaboration. True power does not come from owning more. It comes from creating better, together. Her words hung in the air like music. Liang's team sat silent. Even Alexander's American advisors who couldn't understand Mandarin felt the gravity in her voice. Then she turned to English. Chairman Liang asks for trust. But trust isn't a demand. It's a bridge built with truth. This clause doesn't grant control to one-sided, ensures fairness to both. She paused, her voice softer now. If either side loses trust, the contract is meaningless. But if both sides commit with integrity, the world will remember this partnership not as a deal, but as a beginning. For a long moment, no one spoke. The city outside seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, Chairman Liang smiled. He reached for the pen beside him, clicked it once, and said quietly, "Then let's make history." The sound of pens signing echoed like thunder. Applause erupted. Cameras flashed from the glass doorway. The reporters waiting outside began shouting questions, voices blending with the echo of celebration. Alexander turned to Lena, eyes bright. "You just closed $1 million deal, Miss Joe." She exhaled, finally smiling. "Actually," she said softly, $500 million. He laughed. "Right, $500 million, and you made it sound effortless." Liang stood and extended his hand toward Lena. "Miss Joe," he said warmly, "if you ever wish to leave hospitality, there will always be a place for you at Zhao Industries." She smiled. "Thank you, Chairman. But for now, I think I'll finish what I started." Alexander looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, saw not a waitress, not a translator, but an equal outside. Flashes of light burst like fireworks as the story broke across every screen in Shanghai. Waitress turned translator seals. $500 million deal. Billionaire CEO and Waitress rewrite history. And amidst the noise, Lena Joe stood quietly at the edge of the room, watching the city's skyline blaze like it was applauding her back. The next morning, the city of Shanghai woke up to headlines that felt almost unbelievable. From Waitress to Wall Street heroine, the woman who spoke for two worlds. Grant Global's translator becomes face of historic partnerships. Every financial channel replayed the signing footage. The confident woman speaking fluent Mandarin and English as billionaires listened in silence. Clips of Lena Joe explaining clauses, diffusing tension, and turning negotiation into harmony went viral overnight. By noon, her face was on every major news site from Beijing to New York. Talk shows debated her story. LinkedIn exploded with praise. Even politicians quoted her closing line, "Trust isn't a demand. It's a bridge built with truth." At the Grand Meridian Hotel, The place where it had all begun. The staff gathered in the break room, watching the television mounted on the wall. The same waitress who once balanced trays of crystal glasses now stood on international news. Me. The cashier wiped her eyes. She used to eat lunch right there, she said softly, pointing at an empty chair. And now, look at her. Meanwhile, high above the city, Alexander Grant was on a call with his New York board. Yes, he said, pacing slowly across the penthouse suite. The deal's signed. Zhao Industries has committed to joint production in Suzhou. It's official. The voices on the other end congratulated him. But one question kept returning, and this translator, one executive asked, "Is she still part of your team?" Alexander smiled faintly. "No," he said. "She's not a translator anymore." He glanced at the window, where the skyline shimmered like 1,000 golden promises. "She's joining the company, officially, head of cross-cultural communications. I want her running the Asia office." There was a pause on the call. Then someone laughed. "From waitress to executive in 3 days? You sure you're not being sentimental?" Alexander's tone hardened slightly. "No, I'm being smart. You can teach language. You can't teach what she has." He hung up before they could reply. That evening, as the golden light faded into twilight, Lena stood in front of the Grand Meridian Hotel once more. The marble doors glimmered under soft lanterns. She hesitated, then stepped inside. The familiar scent of polished wood and jasmine tea greeted her. Everything looked the same. The chandeliers, the marble floors, the gentle murmur of guests. Yet everything felt different. The restaurant manager, Mr. Hon, spotted her first. He froze mid-step. "Lena?" She smiled softly. "Hi, Mr. Hon." He blinked, taking in her tailored suit. The ID badge clipped to her lapel. Lena Zhou, executive, Grant Global Technologies. You're, he stammered. Speechless, still me, she said with a small laugh. Just standing on the other side of the table now. May ran out from the back, nearly dropping a stack of menus. "Lena, we saw you on TV." The whole staff watched. Lena's eyes softened. "I couldn't have done it without this place. Without all of you." She looked around. The tables where she'd once served wealthy guests who never looked her in the eye. The same air that had once made her feel invisible now felt alive, almost sacred. "Do you remember that billionaire who yelled about his champagne glass last month?" May whispered. Lena chuckled. "I remember every glass I cleaned that night." She walked toward the window, where she used to pause between shifts. Staring at the skyline she thought she'd never reach. For a moment, she just stood there, the lights reflecting in her eyes, and whispered to herself, "I made it." Outside, cameras flashed again. Reporters had followed her here, hungry for a new image, a new quote. But this time, she didn't hide. A journalist called out, "Miss Zhou, what would you say to people who think this was just luck?" Lena turned, smiled gently, and said, "Luck is what happens when preparation meets courage." Then she walked away, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor, a sound of confidence, not servitude. Back in the penthouse, Alexander Grant stood by the window, watching a live feed of her interview. His assistant Patrick entered quietly. "She's becoming a global icon, sir. Every outlet wants her story." Alexander smiled faintly. "Good. Let them. She deserves every headline." Patrick hesitated. "Do you think she'll stay with the company long term?" Alexander looked out at the city, his reflection fading into the lights. "Maybe. Or maybe she'll build something of her own. Either way." He paused, his voice almost proud. "She'll do more than any of us ever expected. And somewhere between the skyline and the stars." Lena Jo walked home, not as the girl who served the powerful, but as the woman who became one of them. 2 years later, the world had changed, and so had Lena Jo. What began as a fluke encounter in a Shanghai restaurant had become one of the most talked about corporate stories of the decade. Forbes called her the voice that bridged two worlds. The Financial Journal dubbed her the quiet revolution inside Grant Global, and universities around the world added her name to their case studies on leadership, empathy, and cross-cultural negotiation. But for Lena, it was never about fame. It was about meaning. She had built something extraordinary inside the company. The Global Integration Department, a team of linguists, sociologists, and cultural strategists who worked not with machines, but with people. Under her leadership, the company expanded into markets once thought unreachable: China, Korea, Brazil, Kenya, not through aggressive takeovers, but through understanding, patience, and trust. What Alexander Grant once viewed as soft skills had become the company's sharpest competitive edge. And tonight, as Lena stood backstage at the World Economic Leadership Summit in Geneva, she felt the same nervous heartbeat she had felt that night at the Grand Meridian. Before everything began, the event host's voice echoed through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of Grant Global Technologies, Ms. Lena Jo." The applause that followed was thunderous. Alexander Grant watched from the front row, pride and humility blending in his eyes. He had stepped down as CEO months earlier, recommending her as his successor. The board's approval had been unanimous. Lena stepped onto the stage, the lights washing over her like a sunrise. The hall was filled with leaders, journalists, and students watching from every corner of the world. She smiled, calm, steady, luminous. "When I was a waitress," she began softly, "I used to listen more than I spoke. I learned that every table had its own language, not just words, but gestures, pauses, tones. I didn't know it then, but I was learning the most important skill of leadership, the ability to listen." The room was silent. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. 2 years ago, I was serving coffee to a man who had lost his translator. That man taught me that power isn't about who speaks the loudest. It's about who understands the deepest. In that moment, neither of us saw a waitress or a billionaire. We saw possibility. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the hall. Today, our company employs over 100,000 people across 60 nations. And our single rule for every leader is simple: never underestimate the person who serves you. Because greatness doesn't wear a uniform. It waits quietly for someone to listen. The audience rose to its feet in applause. Cameras flashed. But Lena barely heard them. Her eyes had found Alexander in the front row. He was smiling, not the confident, controlled grin of a CEO, but something softer, proud, grateful. After the ceremony, he met her backstage. The noise of the crowd faded behind them. "You spoke beautifully," he said. She smiled. "You used to say I talked too much," he chuckled. "I used to say a lot of things, most of them wrong." They walked toward the terrace overlooking Lake Geneva, the same lake where Emily Petrova once stood in another story, another life. The water shimmered under moonlight. "I still remember the night I panicked," Alexander said quietly. "You didn't just save a deal. You saved the way I thought about business, about people, about worth." Lena looked at him, her expression calm but warm. "You gave me a chance when you didn't have to. You listened. That's what makes a real leader." He nodded slowly. "And you, Lena Jo, taught me what leadership really means." They stood there in silence, mentor and student, equals now, watching the reflection of the city ripple across the water. Months later, a new plaque appeared in the lobby of Grant Global's Shanghai headquarters, dotted red, "The Bridge Room," dedicated to the moment when understanding triumphed over fear, inspired by Lena Jo, who proved that courage can speak any language. Every new recruit walked past that plaque on their first day. And somewhere in the world, in a small restaurant not far from where it all began, a young waitress would glance up at the TV, see Lena's face during a news interview, and whisper to herself, "Maybe one day, me too." Because that's how stories like Lena's live on, not as fairy tales, but as roadmaps for courage. She was never just a waitress. She was a woman who saw an open door in the middle of a crisis and walked through it.